as the ceasefire in Gaza remains fragile and discussions continue on the next steps in rebuilding and rehabilitating the besieged Strip, I sat down with Scotland's former First Minister, Humza Yousaf, one of Europe's most vocal leaders, calling for peace and justice in Gaza and consistently raising the plight of the Palestinian people. On the sidelines of the TRT World Forum, we discuss Gaza, global leadership, and Scotland's moral stance in world affairs. I'm Kubra, Akkoc, and this is One on One. Mr. Humza Yousaf, thank you very much for joining us here on TRT World on the sidelines of TRT World Forum.
Pleasure.
You've been very vocal about the plight of the Palestinians since the beginning of this conflict, and you're one of the very few leaders doing so in Europe. How do you evaluate the current fragile ceasefire framework? How confident are you that it is going to last?
Well, it is fragile, and already, of course, Israel has violated it on a number of occasions with devastating consequences. I think, unfortunately, we've become so desensitized to the scale of Palestinian deaths that when we hear Israel has killed another 100 or 140, really the world doesn't even blink an eye. But almost half of them were children. So we have become so desensitized to the scale of death in Gaza that we forget just how awful the suffering is. In terms of the prospects of peace, of course the ceasefire is fragile, and we call on all regional partners and world powers to make sure that we hold Israel and, of course, Hamas to account for what they have to do in terms of the ceasefire. But if we really want to deal with the root problem, well, we know that the root problem is that there is not equality of status or rights. So we do not have an independent, safe, secure, viable Palestinian state that sits alongside an independent, safe, secure, viable Israeli state. So a lot of the world recognizes one state, the Israeli state, but doesn't recognize the Palestinian state. And until we have a recognized Palestinian state, not just by some countries of the world, but with its own seat in the United Nations, formally recognized and functioning government, then I'm afraid we'll continue to see these cycles of violence every few years.
So what's your message would be to those who are still resisting to recognize Palestine as a state, especially to those who are maybe advocating for permanent ceasefire, advocating for stability and security in the region, but again, resisting to recognize Palestine as a state?
Let's just be clear about it. We need the United States to recognize a Palestinian state. And I would appeal to Donald Trump, who has made it clear he wants to be involved in as many peaceful negotiations as possible. So if that is the case, if he wants to promote and protect his legacy as a so-called peacemaker, then we need you to do what no president before you has done. And we need you to recognize the Palestinian state and push for that recognition and make sure that happens within the United Nations. Because even when we have powerful countries such as the United Kingdom, France and others who have recognized the Palestinian state, there is not a recognized, independent, viable Palestinian state that exists. So we must collectively begin to build the institutions of governance for that state.
Do you think that wave of recognition surrounding the UNGA by France and the UK mainly gave that momentum to this Sharm el-Sheikh process and then later the declaration and implementation of the ceasefire? So do you think that recognition even meant more than those countries would ever imagine?
I suspect so, but it does thoroughly anger me and depress me that it took almost 70,000 Gazans to be killed, almost 20,000 children to be killed, every single hospital bombed, every school, every university either destroyed or damaged, refugee camps bombed, and the mass starvation of 2 million people for the powers like the United Kingdom and France to say, well, maybe we should do something different and we should begin to recognize the Palestinian state. But listen, recognition of the Palestinian state, of course, was important and had follow-on momentum. But there are too many governments, European governments, that continue to be complicit, including the United Kingdom government. So on the one hand, they recognize the Palestinian state. On the other hand, they're still selling arms and weapons to Israel that is committing the genocide in Gaza. It is still, I'm afraid, a record of complicity.
When it comes to the next steps to be taken in Gaza, when it comes to the rebuilding and the rehabilitation of Gaza, of course, if the ceasefire holds, US President Donald Trump seems like he's prioritizing Gulf nations, normalizing ties with Israel, like them joining Abraham Accords, rather than this implementation of two-state solution and recognition of Palestine as a state, as an independent state. Does that concern you?
Yes, I have concerns with the so-called Trump peace plan. Look, I think credit where credit's due. Donald Trump has managed to force parties to come together and brought forward a peace plan that, although it's fragile, again, it's far more than his predecessor did in his time in office. And I think Joe Biden's legacy will be tainted because, and quite rightly so, tainted and frankly blood-soaked because of the genocide in Gaza. Look, I am all for the rebuilding of Gaza, but what we don't want is Gaza to be rebuilt only to be destroyed again in a few months or the next year. That is the cycle of destruction and trauma that Gazans have been living through since 1947. And so we need to make sure that there's a lasting peace. And if you want a lasting peace, you have to address the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is Palestinians are not treated as equal citizens. Their state is not equal. They do not have a state that is internationally recognized, sitting at the UN, that has equal rights of any independent nation in the way that Israel does. So until you address the root injustice that the people of Palestine have suffered for 77 years and continue to suffer, then I'm afraid we'll continue to see this violence, and we'll continue to see the destruction and theft of Palestinian land.
And you've been an example, being the Scottish First Minister, advocating for the plight of the Palestinians, being vocal about the atrocities committed across the besieged Gaza Strip. How do you see your country's role, Scotland's role, when it comes to shaping the moral and humanitarian dimensions of global or regional issues or crises like this one?
I think small countries can play an enormously big role. And you talked about momentum. I think when you look at the actions that Ireland, Norway, Spain have taken, I think actions the Scottish Government have taken, although we're not an independent nation yet, I'm afraid, we still have some influence on the global stage. Those small countries working collectively can begin to put pressure on some of the larger nations and perhaps those that have, or seem to have, more geopolitical influence than we do. So I think small nations absolutely have a role to play. We can also be seen as an honest broker in a way that other countries maybe that have particular historical baggage, like the United Kingdom, of course, and we know their historical role in Palestine over the decades. The smaller countries often don't have that same historical baggage and can therefore be honest brokers in peace. And I think there's an important job for smaller countries, middle countries like Turkey, who have shown themselves now to be an extremely invaluable asset when it comes to conflict resolution and mediation too.
And if maybe talk about the specific steps that Scotland has been taking to assist the Palestinians, what would those be? How would you be describing them?
Yeah, so Scotland has always tried to take a very moral stance, an ethical stance in its foreign policy and its international affairs. We are part of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom government still has responsibility for its foreign affairs, but we can do things within our limited powers. For example, we cut off diplomatic relations with Israel. We said we cannot have normal relationships with a country that is committing a genocide. We stopped funding for Scottish arm companies that were possibly selling arms to Israel. So all of this began to put pressure, I think, on the United Kingdom government, and of course then the United Kingdom government agreed to the recognition of the Palestinian state. So small countries, even at the subnational level, like Scotland, all have a role to play in these matters.
And pressure is key here, key word here, I believe, because all guarantor countries, including Turkey, has been calling more nations, specifically Western and European nations, especially those who engage with Israel diplomatically on every level, to exert more pressure on Netanyahu's government so that this wouldn't be a complicated process. And as Turkey would say, for example, Israel won't be treated as if it's the innocent one. So the pressure, I believe, here is the key word.
I think pressure is key, but I think a more important word is accountability. Pressure, of course, is important. But if you want to stop war and incentivization for war, there has to be accountability through the ICJ, through the ICC, through the enforcement of international law. If you do not have accountability, then if you're a warlord and you want to expand your empire and you think international law doesn't apply, then what stops you? Nothing stops you. You go ahead and you try to expand your territory. And that's why we have to send a very clear signal, this is not just about Gaza or Palestine, as important as that is to me personally and to the world. This is much bigger than that. This is about, does the global rules-based order exist, or has it completely collapsed?
And on that, lastly, sir, how those reforms would look like in your opinion, or maybe would there be establishments of new mechanisms overall rather than just reforming the existing structure so that this whole thing can be fixed and it can be amendable so that international law can be respected and can be upheld again?
If we lived in a world that was fair, then as actually His Excellency the President has said, the world is bigger than 5. If the world was fair, we would have a different mechanism than a Security Council that gives veto to 5 nations. But I'm afraid the pragmatic reality is those 5 countries will not give up their veto. So we have to find new mechanisms by which we can enforce international law, and countries can't just ride roughshod over it and overturn international law. So there's many good people with great legal minds who are working on this already, and certainly they have my support in this endeavour, because if we do not have international law that can be enforced, then I'm afraid we will have too much war, too much conflict in our world.
Mr. Humza Yousaf, thank you very much for joining us here on TRT World.
Pleasure.